So do let me know once you can able to see my screen.
Yes,
Yes, we can.
Okay. So yesterday I asked a simple thing like instead of calling the batch class, call that from an Apex trigger, isn't it? That's the only ask I made, right?
Yes.
So what I'll do, uh, how to call a batch job? System dot database dot execute batch, right? Yes or no? Private void call batch job Apex job. Just like how you have to create an object for a class. I mean, which class? For batch class, batch ID equal to database dot execute batch, right? Your batch is OPG and batch size I will say 200 or I'll say 10 records or I'll say one record only. It's fine because we have a less number of records. So I'll process the records a chunk by chunk, like record by record. So and then we decided to call this batch from all the events, isn't it? Yes or no?
yes, Deepak.
You- Do I need to call my batch class in before insert? Ideally, you don't want to do because in before insert there is no account information for you. In our case, we don't want to do that. Okay. Even for batch effects of often, so we can have an update here. Deploy. If you are not speaking, please yourself in mute. I'm getting a lot of background noise. So now let me go back to Apex jobs. Okay. And now I'll go to my accounts. Now I'll say Genie Point details. I'll edit name. Submit. Save. Is my batch started? It should ideally start. That's the expectation. Refresh. When my batch process today 6/18/13. Okay. Problem here is here. Account trigger dot metadata is active. Deploy.
Deepak, what was this? You changed it now?
No, I just deactivated my account trigger. Now I'm making it active.
Oh,
Instead of doing from UI, I'm changing in a metadata. edit, and I saved it. Refresh. Now you can see exception cannot insert update activity in account trigger before system to asynchronous action called. Okay. Now we got debug logs. It's not recorded. Okay. Delete. Perfect. Refresh. Now let me edit again. Edit. And I simply save. And now, so we are getting into errors. So totally 21 batches are processed. Out of 21, how many got success? 0, because 21 failures in this case, right? Refresh. Anyway, it's not recording here. Let me download my log from here. sfdx get apex debug logs. This is my error. We got it here. And what the error it is talking about? Cannot be called from the batch start, batch execute, or the future. What it is saying, what exception? System dot asynchronous exception, right?
Yeah.
What is asynchronous exception? Yesterday, what I said for a batch class, another batch class should be invoked from a finished method, not from the execute or start method, right? Yes or no?
Yes.
But in this case, if I update my accounts, what is calling? Trigger is calling indirectly, right? Inside trigger, what we are doing? We are calling a batch, right? Which is not right as per the requirements, isn't it? You can see, right? So here in execute method, accounts are getting updated. As soon as account is getting updated, the trigger will execute. In trigger in before update, what we have? You are calling a batch class again. So now, who is responsible for this trigger handler? I mean, who is responsible in invoking trigger? Batch class only, right? Due to batch class updates only, your trigger is executing now, isn't it?
Yes.
So it means, so batch class is calling trigger, trigger is calling batch class. Now what happened? Indirectly you are calling your execute, another batch class from the execute method. Yes or no?
Yes.
So even this is not allowed. A batch class cannot be executed from the execute method. This is an execute method and you are calling your trigger based on the DML operation. From there, if you try to invoke any other batch class or anything else, it will throw an error called asynchronous exception. A batch class cannot be invoked from another batch class execute method. Clear? If you ask me, Deepak, how can we control this? It's very simple. We have a method provided by Salesforce to understand whether this is calling from batch class or not. That is called the way we have for trigger like is after is insert and all this stuff. The same thing we have a system class. Let me open a system class for you first. System class in Apex. We have a system class in Salesforce Apex. There we have a parameters like is batch, is future, is schedule, and we have all the boolean variables like where you can able to understand whether it is calling from batch or not. System.isBatch returns true if the batch apex is invoked and then executing. If false, in API version 35 and earlier, also returns true if it is a queuable apex job is invoked. Even if it is a queue, then it will return. Is future callback, is future, is queuable, is running elastic computer, is schedule, move password, now returns the current user date time in GMT time zone. Process workflow IDs like you have all the system class run as. So now what method we needed? We needed like is batch, right? We need a method called
So
is
is
batch. So system dot is batch. System dot is batch. So now what happens? Even though this will execute only, not system is batch. This is we need to do. We need to call batch class only when it is not a batch class, when it is not executing through batch class, right? Yes or no?
yes, the
Yeah. Now let me go and update my name. Apex jobs. 21 is successfully transaction completed. Now refresh it. It got updated, right? You can see the name, right? We are changing a name by adding a current tag. Okay. So what is the takeaway from now till now? The takeaway is that you cannot call directly or indirectly another batch class from the batch class execute method. Clear?
yes, the
Yeah. So how can you control this? So in we don't want to do any extra stuff here. We have a Salesforce provided system method called isBatch from system namespace. Namespace in the sense system class. From the system class, and you can see namespace is also a system. From the system namespace, you can have a method called isBatch, which will return true if it is executing through batch class. If else, it will return false if it is not executing from a batch class. Based on this method, you can able to judge whether it is calling from batch or like not. What happens? What kind of error will encounter if the batch class is called from another batch class execute method? What is that error that will encounter?
asynchronous exception.
System dot asynchronous exception, which is not allowed. Okay. Any questions? Okay. Now, as you know the batch class now, let's jump into our process, event process. In event processor class, roll up after update, and this is published. As we decided, if the number of data is containing greater than 100, greater than 10, we'll not call roll up on insert and we'll not call this one. We thought to call as a batch class, isn't it? Yes or no?
Deepak, once again, can you repeat? It's
No, if you remembered our earlier conversation, if you have a roll-up events, if you have a roll-up events, or like if you have a event processing data is more than 10 records for particular object, we thought to have a batch class to process that information, isn't it?
yes, yes,
Right? So we need to create a batch class, right? Let's create
yes,
one
yes.
batch class, sfdx create apex class event process.
Deepak, to check that comments, what was that you typed system class in Apex?
Which one?
To check the commands, each batch, everything.
Okay, that is a system class in Apex.
Okay,
So otherwise you can always do, right? The only possible way, like if I say, if you don't know anything, simply write system soap API. Simple. Okay. This system is
okay,
for everything. Soap API Salesforce, if you add system fields, and no, you don't get, you need to write a class on the system class. If you are thinking something on Apex class, then put class name, system class in Salesforce, or if it is objects, then use SOAP API.
okay then.
Yeah. Application reader, system.get application read mode. What is this method called? Returns a read write mode for an organization during Salesforce upgrades and downtimes. Okay. Mm-hmm. Cool. So, what's the implementation that we need to use here? What is that implementation for a batch class? Implements database dot. Here you have right database dot batchable. How many interfaces? How many methods that we need to implement now? What is the syntax? Public. What is the return type? Database dot
Query locator.
query locator start method. And what is the parameter that we have here?
Database dot batchable content.
Database dot batchable context.
Content.
Context.
Context. Okay.
And 1 minute. What the hell is this happening? Oh, looks like my snapshot is working. SCS batch class. Oh, okay. This is quite good. So name, batch pool, allow callouts, queries forming, execute method, finish method, can't trigger, sending email, and it was quite nice. Anyway, we'll go through this type of implementation later. For now, let's delete it. Yep. And we have here query locator, isn't it? Return database dot query get query locator, right? And we'll say
Yes.
query. Now this query I will define outside a class. Public string query. Public string query. return. And what is the next method that we had? Execute method.
Public void execute database dot batchable content
Yes,
context.
public void executes. Control C. Execute. And did I have it? How many parameters we have execute method? There are two
Uh,
parameters.
Two parameters.
One is like batchable context. The other one is list of
List object and the scope.
list objects in scope. Here object can be a typed object or it can be anything. Let me define my object name is this object only. Let me define and I'll go with a scope. And next one public void finish method, right?
Yes.
And here how many parameters I have? In finish method, how many parameters I will be having? Only one
Only
parameter.
one. Only one.
Batchable context BC. And this is also a not void method. There will be no return for it. Deploy. What is saying? Must implement a method database.batchable dot execute batch of list of object. I think that method name is wrong. Method name is wrong. Spelling typo error. Now it got deployed, right? Yes or no? Now if the number of records is greater than 10, if the number of records is greater than 10, so what's the expectation? You need to call your batch class and you need to process the information. Yes or no?
Yes.
Now in this case, again, what I'll do, here I'll write my batch class. Here I'll write my batch class. If, as we saw right now, there is a method for batch class, whether this is executing from a batch class or not. System dot is batch. Control X. If not system dot is batch, then I'll call my event process obj equal to new event process id batch id equal to database dot batchable database dot execute batch, sorry, execute batch and obj I'll say 10. So now what does it mean? It will execute 10 records. Now here the only thing greater than 0 and less than 11. That is what it means, that right? Less than 11 in the sense still 10 we are allowing. That's the expectation, isn't it? Let's get deployed. As I said, here we are not writing a query inside batch class, isn't it? Are we writing a query inside a batch class?
No, outside where it.
So then we need to format a query from the wherever you are trying to invoke your batch class. Obj.query equal to select id here. Okay, record dot this one. Details. Okay. Now I'll say map comma id comma event process equal to new map of id comma event underscore process select id, and then what and all fields we needed. Record.json, we need this field, comma json, current json, and we need old id, comma old json, comma, and what else we're using here? Serialize object.class, event type we are using. Okay, event type we already use, right? Event type from old json, from this one. From event process where id in column where you have id database dot date dot keyset. So this is how we are passing a query. But here is a problem I'll show you later. For now, let's think about this way. Otherwise, I'll do this way. 1 minute. Set up equal to new set of id. Event ids dot add event ids. Sorry, it's record dot id. So I'm capturing all my event ids and I'm passing it as a query. Okay, say deploy it. But whatever we're doing is right. But this is not completely right. This is partially right. I'll show you why. I'll show you why. Let me go to developer console. Let me go to developer console and I'll show you why that is not completely right. Close all. Let's say I'm creating one simple Apex class. Class POC. In this, I'll try to query public static void get query. Okay, I'm writing a method called get query. In this query, what I'll do, string, otherwise I'll say string is equal to public query and here I'll say system.debug query. So this is looking as similar as our batch class, isn't it? Public static query. Okay. This is as same as our query and the start method in our batch class, isn't it? If you can see the query and you have in a start method, right? If you can see in these two steps, it's same, isn't it? Yes or no?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Now what I'll do, I'll say class POC dot query equal to select ID from account. Okay, select ID from account, and then I'll do like class POC dot get query. If I execute this method, I got whatever I entered, isn't it? So I entered like a select ID from account, I got it. Fine. So simply, instead of just displaying this, we'll display this one for account REC colon database dot query. I'm querying my data here. In this case, I'm just querying my data. Query system.debug account name, and I'll display my account name. In this case, what happens if I execute select ID, common name from account, select ID, common name from account, what happens? You will get all the accounts listed and it will be showing off their names, right? Through for loop. You got all the records, isn't it? Yes or no?
Yes, David.
Okay. Now let's go back and update a simple query saying that I'll add one more string. I'll add string ACID equal to. So I'm expecting here where ID equal to colon ACID. Now how many accounts I should get ideally in this case? Only Genie account, right? That's what ID we are passing equal to ACID, isn't it? Okay. So if I try to execute now, Variable does not exist ACID. Why it is showing variable does not exist ACID? So you think that I'm writing this as a wrong?
I think in system.debug we didn't call the ID.
No, we have ID, right? Why
Yeah.
system.debug you need to call ID? ACID. In debug I want to display only name only. But understand whether this variable is inside class or outside class.
It was outside.
Outside class. But whatever the column you are giving, it is tried to decode only when the query is executing. The time it is executing query, do you have a ACID inside a class?
No, no.
No. To correct this one, right, all we need to say public static ACID, and you can simply say ACID dot. You understood?
Yes, got it.
Now ACID is available, yes or no? Now if I execute, absolutely fine. Debug only. Now you got only Genie point as account name. That's the expectation. What is take away from this statement? What is take away from this executions? If you are building your dynamic query and if you are using a colon mark, if the query is executing in a different class, ensure that whatever the colon variables you are passing, that variables also available in the class itself or a method itself. Clear?
Yes, clear.
Okay. Now, if you see the same thing here, I'm trying to pass colon event IDs. In batch class, do we have any events ID variable here? Do we have a variable of event IDs?
No, we need to create.
Exactly right. So all we need to have our event IDs need to be defined. Let's say public event IDs, and you have to define it. Now what and all we need to do? Let's say deploy it, because this is event IDs. All you can do that obj.event IDs equal to event IDs. Variable name should be same. Before you do anything, your variable name should be same. Now you understand why I was explaining that POC, that code or in developer console, right? Because I am using event IDs and this query will gonna run at line number 15. The time it is running, you do not have a variable called event IDs defined. So you'll get an error query exception saying that there is no variable found called event IDs. Okay?
Okay.
Yep. Any question here? Any questions? And in the execute method, I don't do such big class invocation. So you know what need to be called? I'll say dot, and this method is private for me. I'll make it as a public, and I'll call my process contacts, and I'll pass my scope. And here it's very clear, like event process, and I'll pass my scope, right? And what is the batch size that I am passing here? What is the batch size that I'm passing here? 10. So it means whenever the batch is running, which records will execute? These records only will execute, right? It will not call batch class anymore, isn't it? Yes or no?
Yes, Deepak, only that length.
Yep. So for the other check, we can also ensure that and greater than 10. If it is greater than 10, then only it will call batch class. That's the expectation. So as soon as batch class invokes with a 10, so it will call your event processor again with a size of 10. So this way we can, you made your processing size is very less, right? Your logic remains in the same, whatever you have written here, it's same. The only thing is that if it is like greater than 10 records, you are calling the batch class continuously with a batch apex. If it is not 10 records, you are just calling directly insert methods, roll up details. Clear? Any questions?
No, Deepak, need to try this first.
Okay. Anyone have any other questions in this? If you are connected to the old requirement, the one we discussed in the flow chart, if you remember, so we had a discussion in the flow. You remember this flow that we discussed a little early? Is having more than 10 records, yes, invoke a batch class and then call rollups to accounts. If it is less than 10 records, call rollups to accounts. That was the same thing that we are doing now. If you can see here, if it is greater than 10 records, less than 11 means it should be ideally 10. We are calling rollups directly. If it is greater than 10, we are calling batch class. That batch class with a size of 10, it means that it is less than 10. It's not greater than 10. So ideally, we are calling your event processor method. As soon as you call your event processor method, what is happening? It is calling your rollup. That's the flow that we are talking about right here. Yes or no?
Yes.
Now it become like asynchronous. Like now we can able to do a data manipulate. In a way that record management. Like you don't want to process a bulk operations. You can able to do a bulk operations chunk by chunk, so that there will be no more issues.
Deepak, if we do by batch process, time will be increased or decreased?
Of course, batch class takes times, but it just user don't want to wait. These are a backend operations, so user can check later instead of checking in the same time. You submitted your request. It takes time to process. User can relax and he can do other works. You don't want to wait on a loading icon.
Oh,
Imagine this way, Vamsi, because we are using a trial environment, so we have a less data, isn't it? If it is a real time, right, you will be having a huge data to process. To process that much of data, it will take a time. The user need to wait for it so much of time for that loading icon because the process data is processing, right? Now what this batch class will do, user don't want to wait. He can complete whatever the main actions he wanted. The batch class will do a database sync up like third party integration callouts and updating other environments and processing a bulk data to qualify the information. All this we can take it as a backup, background. This way user don't need to wait. The batch class will execute at a system mode that will run smoothly.
okay, got it.
Yeah. So if all will be using transaction, this is on validation rule, other business process, this is something like user needed immediately. So we are doing in a one streamline. If something is not needed, we are taking a piece. There will be multiple trails like this. It's not just one event process. There will be having multiple event processing, like subtasks. These subtasks can process in background. User no need to care about it. What is happening there, right? Yeah, that's the expectation from this.